La parola torna adesso a Beppe perché deve intervistare e introdurre. Lo facciamo insieme? Jill Abramson è la nostra guest star di oggi. Direttrice del New York Times, a woman! Great! I'm very proud. It's very.
I like you too.
Yeah,
Very rare that a woman.
il formato che usiamo è questo. Allora, adesso ascoltiamo Jill, poi io salgo e facciamo una breve conversazione noi. La farò in inglese per motivi che poi spiegherò, cui mi sento lei forse è un po' più facile per me, anche per lei. E poi le domande, quindi un terzo. Please.
Your speech first.
Okay.
Thank you.
Over here. Yes. Okay. Good morning. Good morning to students and their teachers who are here, and to my fellow journalists. I want to begin by saying how impressed I am with the program that we have had here, that the quality of the speakers and especially the quality of the questions from the students has been so extraordinary. I know we have focused a lot of our remarks and our questions on quality journalism, but I think that what your questions, especially the students, have taught me is that maybe the most important thing about quality journalism is having critical and incisive readers. And I can see especially that all the students who are here benefiting so much from the program have those powers of insight and criticism that are so important. And I loved Peter Kahn's 10 rules for quality journalism, and I'm going to beg him to send them to me, even though I saw that his rules are handwritten. I want him to forward them to me so I can share them with all the journalists at the Times. And I think all of you, like me, were impressed so much by Peter's sincerity about journalism, and I, like him, am going to focus on content and the importance of powerful storytelling, which I think is one of the most critical aspects of quality journalism. When I return to the United States from Italy, I will be attending a ceremony where the Pulitzer Prizes are awarded. The New York Times won 4 of these prizes in 2012, and we won them for 4 stories, all of which are long, deeply reported pieces of investigative journalism, including Snowfall, a multimedia narrative about an avalanche and why 3 people lost their lives in it. But before talking in detail about Snowfall, I wanted to define what I see as quality journalism. And I learned the most about it in my career when I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal many years ago, and Peter Kahn was my boss. This was before the internet. But every day there were 2 long narrative stories on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. They were not necessarily tied to that day's news. They were often investigations that gave readers what I call the story behind the story. They were deeply reported and elegantly edited. They honored the intelligence of readers. These are some of the fundamentals of what I see as quality journalism. It's important to ask, what are the roots of this journalism? It may surprise you, but I'm going to cite one of America's greatest writers of fiction, F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's the author of The Great Gatsby. You probably heard about the new movie version in 3D with Jay-Z's music. It premiered last week at the Cannes Film Festival and features Leonardo DiCaprio in the title role. F. Scott Fitzgerald was not a journalist, but a writer who had the eye of an artist and the pen of a reporter. He wrote The Great Gatsby at the beginning of the great age of Hollywood, as movies were becoming America's dominant storytelling form. Fitzgerald's novels were full of cinematic scenes that readers could almost see in their heads as they read. Fitzgerald was heavily influenced by the cinema, and he in fact died in Hollywood where he was writing screenplays. Though he died a long time ago, The Great Gatsby is still read in America and here in Italy too by millions and millions of high school students because of the quality of his writing. Fitzgerald influenced journalists during another hinge moment in our culture. Gay Talese, whose family is Italian, is a famous journalist in the US who once worked for the New York Times. He left newspapers to write even longer narrative stories for magazines, and then was the author of several best-selling books. Talese has talked about Fitzgerald's work and how it influenced him, especially a short story called Winter Dreams. When Talese began writing for the Times, it was the dawn of television's great age, when TV overtook Hollywood as the principal way people absorbed stories and the news. In nonfiction journalism, Talese used the techniques of both Hollywood film and television writers. He wrote a profile of another prominent Italian-American, Frank Sinatra, which has become one of the most read and admired magazine stories of our time. It's to journalism what Gatsby is to fiction. And the most famous article that Talese wrote is called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. And it was published in Esquire magazine, and it is still taught in many journalism classes in the US. Talese reports and reports, going deeper and deeper to get his facts. It is chock full of detailed reporting, such as the number of toupees that Frank Sinatra owned, nearly 100. He sat in a Los Angeles bar all one night waiting for Sinatra to appear and watching him from afar. Sinatra had a fight that night with another patron because he didn't approve of the scruffy boots the man was wearing. Talese found out the man's identity from the bartender, and the very next day he tracked him down, and he interviewed him for hours and hours. Every detail of their fight is there in Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. You can imagine in your head what every move looked like as you read. The scene unfolds like it would in a movie or television program, but every fact has been double-checked, down to the make and cost of the man's boots. Game warden, $60. Talese outlines his reporting as if it were a screenplay. Act 3, Scene 3. He uses the cardboard that shirts come back from the laundry with to map out his stories and outline them. He cuts the cardboard into 4 pieces, and each piece of the shirt board becomes a chapter of his narrative. This kind of detailed cinematic writing was new in the 1960s. It was called the New Journalism. In its time, it was considered revolutionary, and it appealed to younger readers, which is so important. Aspects of the new journalism began to creep into mainstream newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and later the New York Times. While once the sole province of magazines, long-form narratives and investigations began appearing regularly in these newspapers and others, and many of them won Pulitzer Prizes. Now another screen is becoming the dominant way that readers prefer to read their journalism and even long stories. More and more readers, even those who still cherish the printed page, do more and more of their reading on computer and mobile screens. This technological development, again, like the coming of movies and television, is transforming quality journalism. That brings me to the New York Times story, Snowfall. Snowfall, the avalanche at Tunnel Creek, is a long story. The first draft of it that I read as editor was 27,000 words long, the length of many books. It follows 16 expert speakers and expert skiers and snowboarders caught in an avalanche in the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. As I noted earlier, 3 people died. Snowfall is filled with new types of interactive media that keep a reader on the edge of his seat as he proceeds through the published 17,000-word story. The Times published it as a special section in the Sunday paper, and this is what was an entire section devoted to one story with beautiful photographs and graphics and explanations of the science of avalanches and other key information. And while the printed version is quite wonderful, the digital version of the story, which was on our website and our apps, was even more exciting. The interactive version includes pictures of the 16 skiers, audio interviews with them so the reader can see what they look like and hear what they sound like, which makes the characters a lot more vivid. There are 3D maps that bring you closer to the scene. There are interactive graphics that show avalanche simulations and skier paths down the mountain. Every step of the avalanche and every aspect of the mountain were digitally recreated. None of these elements was completely new. What was new and revolutionary is that they were presented not as separate features that you had to click on to open separately, but as one organic whole. As the reader absorbed the words, he could open, or choose not to, all of these interactive presentations. Each element deepened the story in a different way as readers absorbed the story and went over its different parts. Everything was woven together so that text, video, photography, and graphics could all be consumed together in a way that was similar to reading, but a different kind of reading. It began the way most quality journalism does, with a reporter asking questions. The Times had published a small news story noting the large number of avalanches in 2011 and 2012. John Branch, one of our sports reporters, was interested in doing more research, and he and his boss, the Times sports editor, decided to really investigate the accident at Tunnel Creek. John was lucky because all of the survivors agreed to talk to him, and all the families of the surviving skiers agreed to be interviewed. Reporters do not often get so lucky and have so much cooperation from their sources. Last summer, John and his editors decided to take advantage of this and to do video, shoot photographs, assemble information for motion graphics, create animation and other multimedia applications. Soon the team grew to 17 journalists working on our newsroom almost full-time on this one story, which was not published until the end of 2012. Readers immediately noticed when we published Snowfall that there was something special. It reached 3 million individual readers, many of them coming to the New York Times for the website for the very first time. It drew many young readers who were very interested in reading about the science of avalanches and what happened to these expert skiers. And media writers hailed Snowfall as, quote unquote, the future of journalism storytelling. As executive editor of the Times, I'm eagerly awaiting the next story where we can include even more inventive multimedia resources. This interactive narrative is very much what I mean when I talk about quality journalism and its future. Snowfall involved a very large team of journalists in our newsroom, and the New York Times has about 1,250 journalists working. It's one of the largest newspaper staffs in the U.S., not as large as the Wall Street Journal, as Mr. Baker pointed out yesterday, but large indeed, and luckily the New York Times has the resources to put a large team of journalists on a single story for very long, which is true of all of the stories, including the other 3 that were awarded Pulitzer Prizes. And as you know, the newspaper industry is going through a very challenging transition. Print advertising is in decline. Digital advertising does not yet make up for the loss of print advertising. Many newsrooms have cut their staffs. Lots of reporters and editors in the U.S. are out of work. Some newspapers have even stopped publishing in print. Mr. Baker named some of them yesterday. It is a tense time in our industry. Both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal developed another source of digital revenues, paid subscriptions. Lots of people said users would never pay for news on the web, but they were wrong. It turned out that a few publishers who continued to provide quality journalism and not cut their news gathering muscles could charge on the web. Our digital subscription plan has been a big success, and subscription revenue for both print and digital actually this year outpaced advertising revenue at the New York Times for the first time. This is not a panacea, but it provides a strong bridge as we continue on our path during the transition from print to digital. And if The Great Gatsby can still be a sensation in 2013, I know that the quality journalism of the New York Times, too, will enjoy a very strong future. And now I'm going to show you a film for just a very few minutes about Snowfall so that you can hear from my colleagues themselves how they created this story. So thank you.
February 2012, an avalanche near the Stevens Pass ski resort in the state of Washington, in an area known as Tunnel Creek, kind of outside the ski boundaries. Avalanche killed 3 expert skiers. A couple of days later, we did a page 1 story that kind of explored how there was a rise in the death of experienced skiers as they increasingly went into more perilous areas beyond ski resorts. A couple of months later, we thought maybe we should do a deeper look at what happened on the mountain that day at Tunnel Creek. So we turned to John Branch. And soon John had established really great relationships with the families of the 3 skiers who had died in the avalanche and the skiers who had survived that day. He also got a really good rapport going with snow scientists and climatologists around the world who could help inform the story from the science end. You know, John's not an expert skier himself, he's not a climatologist himself, but he had to sort of immerse himself in both of those worlds to pull this off.
The story really began like any other story. We think there's something there, let's go out and find it. And so I just did what I would normally do, and that's to try to talk to people that were involved, make phone calls and send emails, and try to track down people who could tell me about it. And really it became apparent, I think after I'd probably talked to 5 or 6 people, that there was a potentially really interesting story here, a very potentially educational story here, because the people who were involved in this saw the same avalanche from a lot of different vantage points. And when I realized that we could tell a story weaving together a bunch of witness accounts of one avalanche, I thought it could be really compelling.
And once John completed that initial burst of research and reporting, we became pretty confident about a couple of things. First, we had the ingredients for a great written story. But second, because of John's hard-won access, the nature of the avalanche itself, the setting, we realized we had the potential for some really great multimedia. So that work began. Jeremy White, one of our graphics editors, he happened to be a former regular himself at Stevens Pass, and he started work on a flyover, something that would allow readers to kind of drift over the Cascade Mountains to orient themselves at Tunnel Creek. Then Hannah Fairfield and Joe Ward, also graphics editors, they set about doing additional research. They wanted to capture the fragile layers of the snow and also the power of the avalanche itself. And as John Branch continued reporting, Ruth Fremson took the photographs and Catherine Spangler was shooting video.
The story really lent itself to a video because there were all these elements of drama, emotion, and very compelling characters. And so I think we knew very early on that this was a really good candidate for some kind of in-depth visual storytelling. We also got very lucky in a sense because there was all this amazing eyewitness footage from that day on the mountain because the skiers were actually wearing cameras on their helmets. And so those clips really became the backbone for creating an atmosphere and really taking the viewer to the mountain that day.
We didn't want multiple stories or distracting elements from the main read. We wanted something more unified, like one single story that brought all of these components together. So then we asked, why not synthesize it in a far more aggressive way than we've done previously, bringing everything together, video, graphics, etc. And then pretty soon this was the mission. Then the digital design team got involved. Jackie Mint started working on the interface, and the graphics editors Graham Roberts and Shakeen GV worked on iterations of the animation. So they were collaborating to merge all of these things together, and what we ended up with was Snowfall, something that was altogether different in terms of presentation for what the New York Times had done in the past.
The goal of the multimedia was to just accompany the story the best way it could, to not interrupt from the flow of the narrative, to not distract from it, but to really enhance the story and feel part of the reading experience, because essentially Snowfall is a reading experience, and we were hoping for it to be a sort of a new kind of reading experience.
We used moody, subtly moving images as chapter breaks. Short videos dispersed throughout the story came to life as you arrived at those places. Thumbnail bios of the skiers appeared when the names were referenced in the story, and those thumbnails could be expanded too. We had these really amazing graphics that gave the reader a sense of place and put them on the mountain that day the avalanche occurred. The 3D flyover that allowed readers to kind of zoom over the Cascade Mountains, and also another interactive graphic that charted the path of each skier as they descended down Tunnel Creek that day.
I think the graphics added a lot of clarity because this is a very complex story. There are a lot of facets. It helps to know a little bit about the people and a little bit about the mountain and why this was so appealing to them. So I think in the flyover, for example, you get this sense, this is exciting and this is tempting for people who like to do this sort of thing.
In the end, the reporting was done over 6 months. It included interviews with all of the surviving skiers who were on the mountain that day, as well as their family members, Stevens Pass officials, medical examiners, the police, snow science experts, and we also used audio recordings from more than 30 phone calls that were placed to 911 on that day in February at Stevens Pass. And one more thing, if you're wondering how we came up with the title Snowfall, that was John Branch's creation.
We'll speak English. Dicevo, vi chiedo parleremo inglese perché è più facile, ho la sensazione che it's much better. It's like to coming through an interpreter. I know they're very good, but I think for you it's somehow better for me. I think I'll get better reaction. Jill Abramson is the New York Times is 25 years older than Corriere della Sera. We are old, but you're older.
Mm-hmm. It's a relief to hear something in the US is older than in Italy.
We are pleased. We are pleased. And because, and my editor is here, Ferruccio, your equivalent is here, and Ferruccio, we are, because of the New York Times, we can accept that, right? Okay. And you've been the first editor-in-chief, executive editor in 160 plus year history, is that correct?
The first woman,
The
yes.
first woman, of course. But we have these young women and young men here. So, can you tell me, Jill Abramson at 18 and Jill Abramson at 25. I know at 18 you left a school, was the Ethical Cultural Fieldstone School, and I know you read Machiavelli, and you heard something that struck a chord in you reading Machiavelli. So let's start from the, you went to a school that had ethic in its own name. And so, you at 18, so they can relate to you, and you at 25.
I think at 18, having gone to a school that did emphasize ethics so strongly, is we were constantly asked to examine issues, either in history or in current events, and ask the questions, do the ends justify the means? And we analyzed and picked apart different situations to explore and to have all the students be involved in trying to answer that question, which is often a complicated one. And so I think that had a big influence on me and made me a very curious and inquisitive person, even some would say a nosy person who's always digging and digging behind things to try to find an answer to what is often a mystery. Do the ends actually justify the means?
And then, let's say 7 years, 25, 7 years later, I guess after university?
After the going to university, I had grown up in New York City and spent most of my life, I went to Harvard for university, so I was mostly in the northeast portion of the United States. And I wanted, after university, to really explore the rest of the U.S. And my husband, who was a classmate of mine at Harvard, my husband and I went to live in the South in the U.S., where the southern part of America fought the North in the Civil War. So a region that's very different from the one we both grew up in. But I thought it was really important after university to not be so absorbed. The economy was not so great then either, but to not be so absorbed and focused on what would my career be and what would my job prospects be, but to really try and learn something about a part of my country that I didn't know. And that is when I first started doing professional journalism. I wrote a political column in a tiny weekly newspaper that had Italian in South Carolina, so the heart of the Confederacy, and it had sort of an Italian name. It was called Osceola. I don't know if that's an Italian word, but I started writing a weekly political column there and just found the basic truth about journalists and journalism is being a journalist gives you a passport to meet the most interesting people in the world and to examine the most interesting and important issues. And I just fell in love with that at that point.
Is that true that that young woman turned into the most digitally focused a woman in American journalism? This definition is a colleague of yours. I met him recently and I say, can you tell me about the editor? And he told me a few things. I don't tell him, I can cover my source here. And a lot of interesting things. He likes the way you work, and he say, she is the most digitally focused woman now in American journalism. Maybe, he said, Another one is Arianna Huffington. He mentioned you too. Is that a correct definition of what you are now?
I feel it's a big compliment and very nice to say. And you would have to be a fool as the top editor of any news organization right now not to focus in a big way on the digital presentation of quality journalism. It's, you know, in a way, I'm a reflection of my times. Because when I began in journalism, as Peter noted at the beginning of his career, there weren't even mobile phones. So, but you know, we are in the middle of this very challenging but very thrilling transition from print to digital, and you know that has been my focus.
Is it difficult to convince journalists of our generation to go into, to use video to understand the word has changed? Did you find that difficult in your news organization? Did you find resistance of a generation, which is our generation?
I think I may be an even different generation from you, but
it's just
no, okay. You look very young.
No, I'm not.
But in the early days, there was some resistance, and you know, still some of our correspondents feel. You know, Peter in his remarks talked about the importance of time, of taking some time to absorb what has happened and report more deeply, and to make sure that your analysis of why something happened or how it happened is a correct reflection of actual events. And in the beginning, some New York Times journalists felt, you know, doing video immediately as news was unfolding, or, you know, even filing right away a story interrupted that process. But I think what we found over time, now there are very, very few of my colleagues who don't actually want to participate in multimedia storytelling. Just a very few, because I think they see, and you saw from the colleagues in the film we just saw, that you know they're so excited about using these instruments to deepen the way we present quality journalism, and so everybody now wants to get in on the act.
It was not immediate though, no. and of course I read and the American all American journalists all know, but I have to tell younger people here, there is a website very well known in America on politics called Politico.com, and they had, let's put it this way, and not a flattering portrait of you and your attempt to change the New York Times culture. And I read that even before I knew I would be sitting here with you. When an editor-in-chief in a kind of turbulent times for medias everywhere, finds, you know, in a well-known website as Political, an attack or a portrayal like that, were you upset, or you think it's part of the game?
Both. I was upset, and I thought it's part of the game. When I first read the article, it was late at night, and when I first read it, I was by myself and I cried a little bit. But then, you know, I just said to myself, it is part of the game. There have been many lovely articles written about me, and it's like the subjects of our stories. You have to learn to take criticism as well as give it. And that's, you know, been a lesson that I learned, you know, fairly early as a reporter. And so I put it in perspective. And by the next morning, I was feeling okay. And
in a fighting mood.
Some ways, well, in a fighting mood, and in some ways, I won't say that it was the best revenge because it had nothing to do with the article, but while I've been in Italy, we announced that the New York Times has just hired the most important political reporter at Politico, a man named Jonathan Martin. So
I have trouble picturing you crying a little bit. Ha detto che ha pianto un pochino quando ha letto che crying a little bit. That's unexpected. Just one more question, because now it's for them to ask you a question. Just a final one. You must know, dovete sapere, that Jill, she's a great David Bowie fan. It's a fan. She likes David Bowie. I checked. And these young men and women, they use Post-it out there, and they put like sentences, something they hear here, and they put these, and they stick it to a board. And I picked this pink one, and it said, "Average is over." It's actually, I said this, but it's not my quote. I quoted David Brooks. As I have in my book, and I did it again here. So let's put together David Bowie and "Average is over." I mean, do they need to be heroes just for one day, or they need to be heroes for longer? How can this generation go into, we're talking news media, how can this generation can get into our world? I know it's difficult. You live in America, we're now in Italy, but for instance, and a little follow-up question, Andrea Ceccherini and we're all trying, I've been working with Osservatorio, Giovani Editori and Quotidiano in class for many years, so we are convinced that sort of bringing newspaper to these young makes them more comfortable. So two questions basically, whether you consider what you witness here a right path or one of the path, and then how they can be heroes possibly for longer than one day.
Or 1 minute.
Yeah.
I think that the program has been so excellent, and the practice of bringing newspapers into the classroom and having teachers incorporate the news into what they teach is a fantastic idea, and I admire so much that you do that throughout your country and that this organization exists to do that. And in New York, the New York Times has had a similar program where we get the New York Times into classrooms in New York. And at many universities, we make sure to offer piles of newspapers at a discounted price so that students at the best universities can read also. So I think that is critical, and showing students at a young age that newspapers can be so relevant to their own lives is a wonderful, wonderful mission, a very important one. And I don't think...
We're going to show a new phenomenon. Andrea Ceccherini, un fenomeno di lievitazione.
Oh, yeah.
He's so happy now, having the New York Times editor-in-chief saying this, that you understand that, levitation, like he's going to float around in the air. Sorry for interrupting you.
But I guess for one other aspect of your question, I don't think that it is that a journalist should be a hero, because one of the takeaways from Peter's rules of quality journalism is that the journalist shouldn't involve himself in the story. And I think if you're bent on being a heroic figure in your life, that there would be too much temptation to put yourself into the story. I think, but David Bowie is right, average is over, and I don't think, listening to the questions of the students, both yesterday and today, I don't think we have any worries that the rising journalists of tomorrow in Italy are average. They're clearly the most excellent minds that I can imagine, and I've been so impressed by the students.
Ragazzi, avete sentito? Potete metterlo nei vostri curriculum, questa frase qua. I said I can put this into a resume, what you just said. Well, of course I have so many more questions, but I think it's time for these young men and women to ask you questions. Now, we have to go, so many of them. Why don't you go.
Okay, I'm going to only call on women. And as I look out, most of the hands that are up are the women. So, how about you?
No, I work. And I'm Emilia Menicucci. I'm from Turin, from a high school specialized in classical studies. And after 160 years, you're the first woman to run the New York Times. And you know, thinking about America, that's amazing indeed. And how do you explain this freak in the American social system?
Well, I think in the U.S., one of the most exciting social developments of my lifetime has been the advance that women have made in so many fields across the board. My daughter, for instance, is a surgeon in her second year as a resident, and that's a field that was like 100% men for way longer than anybody in the publishing business. And it's very thrilling for me to see her just unquestioningly and without any kind of special effort, because she's a woman, finding success in a field that was male dominated. And I think actually journalism is a very good field for women now, even though across the industry it's difficult to get a beginning job. But at journalism schools, where I speak from time to time, more than half of the student body is women now, and they will become the journalists of tomorrow. So I feel that that's a great development. And I was only kidding about only calling on the girls, so boys, feel free to raise your hands. Yes.
Aspetta un attimo, scusa, dietro lì, la ragazza.
Good morning. Good morning, my name is Eleonora and I'm from Tortona. I want to ask you this, that is, in your opinion, how can journalists and editors stay in contact with young readers that are of course full of ideas but that also lack of money in a period in which we are going to pay also for digital newspapers? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, the ability to reach younger readers was something that the New York Times considered a lot before we went to a digital subscription plan, because for young people, we are an expensive read. But that is why in choosing the kind of pay plan that we offered, we keep some of our content free so that students can access some content and benefit from the New York Times. But for the heaviest users of our website and of our apps, we ask that they pay a monthly subscription fee. And so I think that it's important to tailor the way that you price subscriptions for newspapers here in Italy that are considering that one thing you don't want to do is cut off young readers, and you want to stay very much as part of the free web and be shared across all media, etc. So It's a worry, though. It's a worry, I think of all newspapers in the U.S. that our readership is aging, and by being inventive digitally, like having stories like Snowfall, it's a new way to try to introduce some younger readers and show them that long, challenging stories can be illuminating and exciting and help explain the world to them.
Ragazzi, ho visto un po' di mani, ma molti di voi hanno già fatto domande in questi giorni, Isidora e altri, quindi cerchiamo di fare chi non ha ancora fatto domande. La ragazza là in fondo.
Hi, I'm Maria Laura from La Spezia, and I would like to know if you don't have fear of entering in a detail of a news, and in specific in the privacy of the people, because I don't know which is the point from which the privacy of the people is start, and I don't know how laws work in journalism, and in specific in American journalism. Thank you.
I think it is very important to respect the privacy of the people as a journalist. Peter Kahn in his comments talked about when the press operates in a pack, it kind of caters to the lowest standards. And something that I have seen in my career is that a normal person who isn't a famous industrial figure or a politician can sometimes find themselves in the middle of a big story, waking up to finding satellite trucks for television on their lawn when just a week earlier they were an anonymous private person. And so it is something that as an editor I do consider, and in stories that are controversial or put a private person into a very public and exposed situation by highlighting them in a story, I make sure that our reporters make the people that they are writing about and talking to understand that they will put themselves in public and that can have some consequences that are very difficult to anticipate. Because I think, it is not good quality practice to just make everybody fodder for journalism without respecting what the impact of being in the middle of a very public situation, what that could be. I think that your question is an excellent one.
The time is up, but you don't have Jill Abramson every day here, so with Ferruccio De Bortoli, my editor-in-chief, your colleague, we decided, Ferruccio, Ferruccio very kindly said you can use a little bit of my time, so we'll have two more questions. We're only 5-10 minutes late. We're doing very well this morning, so we take 10 more minutes for two more questions over there, and that we can say goodbye and thank you.
Hi, I'm Leonardo Noci, and I want to know, according to you, what kind of topics or news do people usually prefer to read in the USA? I mean, films or sport or fashion in general. Thank you.
The New York Times covers a very broad array of news, and some people are addicted to our coverage of culture. I would say the core strength of the New York Times, and it has always been the first pages after the front page of our newspaper, is international news. And I'm very happy that I have not had to cut our news gathering muscle practically just a tiny bit, but in terms of the number of foreign correspondents we have in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, you name it, we have more foreign correspondents now than we did 10 years ago. And actually, our newsroom is exactly the same size as it was 10 years ago. It is not smaller.
One more question over there. Young lady in white.
Salve, sono Fiorenza del linguistico dell'Enrico Medi di Salò e mi scuso ma vorrei fare questa domanda in italiano perché penso che renda meglio quello che sto pensando. Allora, mi ha colpito un po' il racconto Snowfall di prima perché credo che, cioè mi è sembrato, magari è soltanto una mia impressione, ma che abbiate usato una tragedia, perché è una tragedia, a scopo di intrattenimento. A me sembra, è una cosa terribile, sono 3 persone che sono morte e sembra che voi l'abbiate resa qualcosa di puro intrattenimento. Ho sentito parlare di atmosfera, di sentirsi lì, di sentirsi in quel momento, l'eccitazione del momento, ma è una morte terribile.
Help me out.
She said, I was really struck by Snowfall because I seen you started from a tragedy, and she said avete usato una tragedia, then you used a tragedy to entertain your readers. I'm translating, lei ha usato per intrattenere, so entertain your reader. So that's not my comment, that's a question. Corretto? So I was struck by the fact that you started from a tragedy and you used the tragedy in order to interest, but she used entertain your readers. That's the question.
It's a very good question, and when, I don't know where I put it, when we decide to publish the special section, it's a whole section, and the story, it is about a single tragedy. And I worried, I think your question is excellent. As editor, I did worry about the appearance of using a tragedy and exploiting it to entertain. And at first I was skeptical that the story would merit so much space, because this is the same length just about as, I don't know if in high school you all read it, but in America it's widely read. It's the same length as John Hersey, a famous journalist after World War II. He wrote a story that took up the entire well of the New Yorker magazine called Hiroshima. And it was similar in structure. It followed like 6 characters very closely, but that was basically about the birth of the atomic bomb and its consequences, so it had a very important issue at its heart. And with Snowfall, I was initially skeptical that the story itself merited the kind of length and showcasing that we gave it, but actually, as you learned in the film, the story explains the science of avalanches. It documents the effects of climate change in our atmosphere, which figured into why this was such a devastating avalanche. And I think, that if I'm asking again the question that I grew up with, do the ends justify the means, that the means of telling a story and creating a new way of digital readings, justified the end, which was both a long print section in the newspaper and the presentation digitally. But your question is very perceptive and is one that I asked myself and made sure that the story wasn't mere entertainment, but that it was illuminating and fit my definition of quality journalism.
We started from Machiavelli and Jill at 18, we're back to Machiavelli, but the different one. So before we introduce our next speaker and Maria Concetta, just a tiny biographical, but it's such a good. I want to thank the New York Times because I had a book in America. They reviewed the book in such a way that I was all over American television. My book became a New York Times bestseller. I put them on the top with Corriere della Sera of my, so it's a public way of saying thank you a few years later.
My colleague Rachel Donadio, who is our Rome correspondent, is here today, and she started out. She may have stepped out, but there she is. Stand up, Rachel.
Ciao, Rachel.
And Rachel began her New York Times career in the book review. So.
And you have a superstar here. We were in Mantua together, and Rachel is super. So I want Ferruccio to come here because I want my friend and my editor-in-chief to take a picture with her.
Oh,
the
great.
two of you. Come here. And Maria Concetta. So
this seems to.
we'll have a staffetta, as we say.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you. Thank you
are
so
an example
much.
for all of us.
Thank you. Here, so we're gonna.
A tutti sopra il gradino.
No, volevo loro due.
Perfetto.
Okay.
Bene.
You too.
Bene. Ok.
Two directors.
Cosa?
Bene. Ok. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Lovely to be with you.
Grazie Beppe Cervenini, grazie a Jill Abramson.